Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to be talking about what I think is the most interesting type of UFO encounter. It's certainly the most extensive, and that is, of course, onboard UFO experiences. The title of today's episode is Have No Fear: 7 Astonishing Onboard UFO Encounters. I think these cases are really important. They certainly represent the cutting edge of UFO research. They have the most information, more than any other type of encounter, perhaps except UFO crash retrievals. But in these cases, people get to interact directly with the ETs. And I've said this before, but it bears repeating. These are the kinds of cases that hold the most potential to answer the many questions surrounding extraterrestrial contact, such as who are these visitors to our planet? Where do they come from, and why are they here? So I've chosen 7 cases for you today. Probably you haven't heard of most of these. I do like digging up those more obscure cases. And the 7 cases I've chosen for you today come from all over the world, including England, Australia, Iran, Russia, Brazil, and 2 from the United States, including Arizona and Maine. These do involve quite a variety of ET types. Some really good evidence to support some of these encounters. Some are multiple witness. Only 2 of them involve the use of hypnosis, so these are largely consciously recalled, which I think is important because any excuses of false memory syndrome can be easily laid to rest. Many of people absolutely remember their encounters fully consciously. And even the 2 involving hypnosis both recalled seeing humanoids. So yeah, hypnosis does not explain these encounters by any means. So yeah, some really interesting and fascinating cases. I love talking about onboard encounters. I find them, again, endlessly fascinating. So let's just get started with our first case, which I call the onboard UFO encounter of Albert, Lancashire. This is quite an early case. It took place in September of 1942 in Newbiggen-by-the Sea, England. And this is an astonishing case because it does involve a military officer. He did not recall his encounter at first. It came back in dreams and flashbacks sometime after his encounter. But it's certainly an interesting and important case, if only because it's one of the earliest. And in fact, it has been called the earliest onboard UFO encounter in the UK. So that alone makes it significant. This case comes from pioneering English researchers Lionel Beer, Jenny Randalls, and several others. It's appeared in several journals and books. It was a cold evening in September of 1942. This is the middle of World War II, by the way, as Albert Lancashire, a 27-year-old Army sentry guard, stood in his guard booth guarding a secret radar base located about 2 miles from Newbiggen-by-the-Sea in England. This is at the Creswell radar site. He was armed with a loaded rifle and bayonet, but had been given explicit orders not to fire at any enemy aircraft, as this would give away the location of the secret base. Suddenly, an unidentified yellow light appeared low on the horizon, over the ocean, just about 350 feet away. He stepped out of his booth and kept his eye on it when it became obscured by a dark cloud. Moments later, it, or another light, appeared, and this time it was moving even closer. So he thought to himself, what have the Germans invented now? He's not thinking UFOs. UFOs are the farthest thing from his mind. He's never heard of them. UFOs is a subject that hadn't made its appearance in the public consciousness quite yet. So as this thing approached, he saw that it wasn't just a light. It was a strange round craft of some kind. The light was coming from the rim of this craft. Now concerned that whoever was piloting this craft might see him, he stepped back into his sentry box. The craft then moved closer and lower, and this is weird. Albert now felt strangely compelled to step outside the guard booth, and no sooner had he stepped out when this object sent down a beam of light about a foot wide onto the ground, and before he could react, it swept towards him and struck him in the face. He automatically threw his hands up towards his face to protect himself, and as he says, "I don't remember putting my rifle down, but I must have, because it was loaded and had a bayonet attached. I didn't use the rifle because we weren't allowed to. I just put my hands up." So as this light hit him, Albert says he felt a strange floating sensation, and then he promptly blacked out. After an undetermined period of time, he woke up to find himself lying on the ground several feet from where he had been standing. He was pretty dazed and disoriented, and as Albert says, "I lay there for 5 or 10 minutes. I didn't know what had happened." Again, he'd never heard of UFOs, flying saucers, or missing time, so he really had no way of interpreting what he had just experienced. He did have the distinct sense that this was not natural, this object was not of this world, and for some time afterwards he wondered if this might have been a kind of religious experience. He does say that sometime after this he did develop an unexplained rash on his tongue, and he would later wonder if it had something to do with this encounter. But over the next few years, he started having dreams about this incident. In one dream, he found himself inside a strange craft, looking out a large window down at the ocean, while a man dressed in a white uniform informed him that he had had to carry him into the ship. In a second dream, he remembered that he was on the ship again, where he met a woman with red hair, wearing a short skirt, and she handed him a pair of goggles. So these were just dreams, but he connected it to this experience. 25 years passed, and this is when he experienced a series of unusual paranormal events which somehow triggered his memory of being taken on board this craft all those years ago. This began in 1967. He was laying in bed one evening when he noticed a tiny pinpoint of light over the bedroom door. It quickly became brighter and larger and coalesced into the image of a man's head and face. This head had black hair, the face had high cheekbones, a thin beard, the face was tilted upwards and was immobile, though the eyes did move continuously from side to side, and after just a few minutes it faded away and was gone. Needless to say, he found this very puzzling, but shortly after that, something else happened. He was on duty at his job. He was now working as a signalman for the British Rail, and he was in his signal box in the evening when he suddenly felt a presence, and suddenly a brilliant light appeared just a few feet from him. He said it was so bright it hurt his eyes to stare directly at it, but seeing how strange it was, he couldn't help but stare. And then, coalescing out of this light, he saw the head and shoulders of a man, which he said looked like a statue carved out of white marble. There was no real detail to it other than a black line across the top of the head, and this image faded quickly away back into the light, and a few minutes later the light itself faded out. So this was weird, and events were still in progress, because that same month, again, while at work in the signal box, he saw a dark-colored object with little red lights blinking on and off, and it was hovering in the sky about 300 feet away. It slowly lowered down to about eye level, at which point he waved his arm at it, and the object promptly stopped, the red lights went out, and Albert could now see that it was in fact a dome-shaped craft. It immediately darted off at terrific speed, he said, and something else happened just a few days later. Again, at work in his signal box, he noticed a section of one of the walls glowing briefly with an unexplained green light. So all these weird things were going on, and 1 year later, there was another apparent UFO sighting. In December of 1968, he was in his signal booth again when the signalman in the next booth down the way phoned him to alert him to the presence of a bright, glowing object hovering near the chimney of a large mill in that area. They could both see it, and this object was circling around this chimney. They both watched it for just a few minutes when it slowly moved away in a zigzagging movement and then darted away at super high speed in a straight line. And while all this was going on, Albert started having some episodes of ESP. So somehow these weird events broke down the walls of amnesia surrounding his missing time encounter 25 years earlier in 1942. Albert now recalled that when this object had approached his guard booth all those years ago, and he felt compelled to step out and was struck by that beam of light, and he felt this floating sensation, he hadn't actually passed out. Instead, he recalled that he was drawn up into the air by this beam of light. He said it felt as if he was walking, quote, along the beam. Suddenly, he was seized by what he described as pygmy-sized men. He said they were wearing white suits and they carried him on board this craft. Inside, he was met by a man with dark hair who seemed to be wearing some kind of dark goggles. Albert was made to lie down on a table or a couch, and looking up, he could see a blue domed ceiling. Next to him, he saw another table, another exam table, with an Asian-looking woman lying on it. He saw a man wearing what looked like to him a doctor's skull cap leaning over that table. He also wore goggles. This man turned and smiled at him in a welcoming way. Albert himself has vague recollections of being given goggles to put on his eyes and being physically examined by a figure wearing some kind of surgical mask. At this point, his memory fades, and all he recalls is waking up on the ground next to his booth. He did have the sense that the UFO occupants had encouraged him to think of this experience as a dream, or in some way erased his memories from his conscious mind. But remembering all of this, he does wonder if his chronic tongue rash was somehow related to this experience. So again, he waited years. He waited until he was in his 70s to report this experience to UFO researchers, and he only did so after hearing about the Betty and Barney Hill case and hearing about UFOs. And again, his case is often cited as England's first onboard UFO encounter. One of the researchers who interviewed him, Eric Richards, says this: "Mr. Lancashire is by no means a crank. He is absolutely sincere and clearly believes all he has told me. He is in himself definitely sure that they had him in that UFO in 1942 and did something to him. I would say he is above average intelligence. It is my opinion he has had genuine experiences." An incredible case, I think, by anyone's measurement. And it was investigated thoroughly. It's clear this gentleman is not seeking any publicity. He kept his encounter a secret for decades. And yet it does show many of the patterns we see with ET contact. Particularly interesting to me is the fact that he had quite a bit of paranormal and psychic events. So this is something we see a lot with UFO contactees. It's a really amazing case. And so is this next one. I call this next case the Onboard UFO Encounter of Pamela Wimmer. That is a pseudonym. I interviewed this lady personally for my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness. Her case, I think, is quite important for a number of reasons. And it's super interesting also because she remembered it fully consciously and was able to have a conversation with the ETs. The events that happened to her on board are often reported, yet it's really amazing how clearly she recalled all of this. And like many people, this wasn't a one-off. She had experiences throughout her life, and also she has good evidence that this is an experience that is generational as well. Another important pattern. So yeah, a really interesting case in a number of ways. Pamela Wimmer's encounter is one of several onboard UFO encounters I present in my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness. And again, she has elected to remain anonymous, so I've used this pseudonym of Pamela Wimmer. Like most contactees, she's had a lifetime of UFO encounters, and she was reminded of this one morning in 1975. At that time, she was 22 years old, she had a 2-year-old son, and was living in Dresden, Maine. This is a tiny little town. Her child was outside in the front yard, playing with her 6-year-old cousin beneath an old oak tree. Suddenly, Pamela and her brother-in-law, who was in the house, heard the children screaming. Together, they rushed outside and couldn't believe what they saw. There was a massive craft, 200 feet wide, saucer-shaped, hovering about 40 feet above this oak tree. It was shiny silver. It had a dome with about 20 portholes and beautiful bright-colored lights blinking around the rim. They said they were red, blue, green, and yellow. It was perfectly silent, and it was tilted at an angle. It looked to Pamela like it was tilted so it could view the children more clearly. And as Pamela says, I was scared to death. So she ran for her children. They ran towards her. Together they rushed back to the porch and watched this craft for about 10 minutes when it suddenly started to spin quickly, so quickly the colored lights blurred together, and then it darted away at lightning speed. Everyone talked excitedly about it, but all Pamela could think was, not again. Her mind instantly went back to her first sighting in 1963 when she was only 10 years old. She and her best friend were riding their bikes home one afternoon. Their home was about 2 miles away, and this is when they both saw a giant, grayish, cigar-shaped craft moving just a few hundred feet high directly over the nearby Eastern River. They were frightened by its unusual appearance. They could not identify it, so they rode their bikes furiously home and became even more concerned when they saw that this craft was following them. It took them almost a half an hour to get home, so they rushed inside and they dragged out Pamela's father, and he watched it with them for just a few moments when it moved off at a slow pace down the river. So Pamela turned to her dad and said, "What was that?" And her father replied almost casually, "I think it was a UFO." Now Pamela had always believed in UFOs because her father, an Air Force officer, had seen them before and talked about it, and her mother had also had encounters. The weird thing to Pamela was this object had followed her home. So she wondered, was it interested in her for some reason? And 4 years later, she got her answer, and the answer was yes. It was now the summer of 1967. Pamela was 14 years old. She had gone to bed as normal, and sometime in the early morning hours, she woke up with a start. An eerie, heavy silence hung over the house. Something weird was going on. She didn't see anything at first. She sat up in bed just in time to see movement on the wall near her bed, and coming directly through the wall were 3 of what she described as the weirdest looking people she had ever seen. They were very short, 3 or 4 feet tall. They had huge bald heads, large black glistening eyes, no visible ears, a small mouth, very small nose, pale white skin. They were wearing light-colored, skin-tight uniforms with a wide belt, and they moved right up to her bedside. She now, in hindsight, recognizes them as gray-type ETs, but at the time, she had no idea who these beings were. One stood in front of her, while the other 2 gripped her arms and began to pull her from her bed. She became very frightened and resisted, and they immediately spoke to her telepathically in her mind, saying, "Don't be scared. You don't have to be afraid." But Pamela was still frightened and asked them, "Where are you taking me?" And she tried to pull away from them. They told her, "Don't do that. Stay calm. Everything will be fine. We won't hurt you. Be calm." Despite their continued assurances, the being's unusual appearance left Pamela quite scared. As she says, "I never knew anything about grays. I didn't know what it was. It could have been the devil for all I knew. I had never seen anything like it. I never knew there was a creature out there that looked like that. I tried to resist. They had a hold of my arms and they took me through the wall." So when that happened, she felt this weird buzzing feeling, and to her amazement, they took her outside to her front yard, and there was a saucer-shaped craft sitting in the middle of the road right in front of her house. There was a small ramp leading up to an opening, and they quickly walked her up the ramp. She asked them, "Why are you taking me?" And they just replied, "Be calm. You don't need to be afraid. Calm down." And they repeated this over and over as they took her into the craft. Pamela found herself inside a large round room. She said it was brightly lit, though she couldn't see any light source. It was as if the entire room glowed. She said it was slightly cooler inside than outside. She said the walls were a dull silver gray, In the center of the room, she noticed there was a thick column molded into the floor and the ceiling. There were no seams anywhere in this room. On the far side of the room, there was a small metal table with a slight lip around the edge. It was sitting on a single pedestal, again with no seams. It was as if it was part of the craft itself. And also she saw a row of about a half dozen gray beings, or more, staring at her, observing quietly. She had the feeling that they were there to learn about her. At this point, her memory grows a little bit hazy. She believes they took her to the table, put her down on the table, and gave her an examination. She doesn't really remember that in any clear detail. What she remembers next is that they gave her a kind of tour of the craft. One of the Greys took her to the curved wall of the craft and showed her what looked to her like glowing star maps. And she asked them, "Is that where you're from?" And the being replied that they were from a certain star system and actually gave her the name. Pamela didn't understand the word, so she can't repeat it, but she kind of nodded anyway as if she understood. And then the Greys told her, "You can come with us if you want to." This kind of frightened Pamela. She didn't really want to go with them, and she told them, "No, I want to go back home. I want to go home. I don't want to go with you." And they told her again, "Don't be afraid. You don't have to be scared." They repeated this over and over, but this did little to assure her because all she wanted was to get out of there and go home. But the Greys kept repeating, "Calm down, calm down. We're not going to hurt you." One of the Greys then led her over to a porthole and said, "You can look outside if you want to." Pamela did, and she was absolutely amazed at what she saw. There was this bright field of sparkling stars, and far below her was the Earth. As Pamela says, "I could see another UFO and stars. I was thinking, where am I? And I could see the Earth down below. And that really scared me, because I am up in a spacecraft. That's when it really scared me, to see how high up I was in the air. I don't even like heights." So it was now very clear to her what was happening. She was inside a UFO, the same UFOs she had seen as a kid, and these beings around her could only be aliens. Seeing the Earth so far away from her scared her. So she turned around at this point and saw another figure standing or walking through an arched doorway. And this one was a little different from the smaller Greys. This one was taller, about 5.5 feet, and looked like the others, but was much more human looking. She appeared to be female, so this is probably a hybrid. Her skin was pale, she had big dark almond eyes, though smaller than the others. Pamela saw that she had small holes where the ears would be. She did have thin, wispy, white hair, and she was wearing a long, shiny, shimmering gown. This figure looked at her, then back at the Greys, pivoted her head back at Pamela and back and forth to the Greys several times, as if she was curious about what was happening. The next thing Pamela knew, she was back in her bed. It was a few hours before dawn. She lay awake in bed waiting for the sun to rise, and when she finally heard her parents wake up, she immediately approached them and told them what happened. Both were understandably shocked. Her mother didn't really like the subject, didn't want to talk about it, but her father was much more open-minded and accepting, and Pamela told him, "Thanks, Dad, because it really did happen." And following this, there were lots of other strange incidents. Pamela did notice an unexplained healed scar on her leg. She began to experience weird poltergeist-like activity, knocking noises, objects being moved by themselves, doors opening and closing, lights going on and off, and so forth. She also began having weird premonitions. Once while driving with her father, she screamed at him to pull off the road, and that was just in time to avoid a bad collision. On another occasion, she saw exactly where her uncle had lost his watch while hiking in the forest. Now, Pamela isn't the only one in the family who started seeing UFOs, because one day her younger sister said she was walking in the woods and came upon a gigantic glowing orb. It seemed like sooner or later everyone in the family had seen a UFO. But time passed. Pamela grew up, she got married. Then, of course, came this incident in 1975 at age 22 when she and other family members saw this 200-foot wide saucer hovering over the oak tree in the front yard. And it was later, on that same night, she went to check on her 2-year-old son in his bedroom looked out the window, and there was another UFO. This brilliant white light hovering about 50 feet over the nearby river. And as Pamela says, I knew it was a UFO. What else could it be? It quickly moved off, but kind of filled her with some concern because she was again wondering why were the UFOs so interested in her and her family. And sure enough, 1 year later, she and her boyfriend were in the kitchen one night when they both saw an object shining a brilliant beam of light through the kitchen window. So they rushed outside to see this brilliant, silent object hovering overhead, still shining this beam of light directly on them. Frightened, they ran back inside, took refuge in the living room, and the object shone the beam on them again through the living room window, and then it left. But it was this series of sightings that caused Pamela to start researching the subject, and she was shocked to read accounts similar to hers. She ended up contacting MUFON, worked very briefly with an investigator who reassured her that, yeah, her experience was real and matched the accounts of others, which by then, of course, Pamela already knew. There were long quiet periods with no UFO activity, but sooner or later, it seemed the UFOs always came back. For example, in 1986, at age 34, she stepped outside her home to wait for her teenage son who had gone to visit a friend and was a little bit late returning home. So she was out there waiting for him, and suddenly she got the feeling of being watched. And turning around, she saw, coming right over the top of her house, a, quote, saucer-shaped craft. She could hardly believe how close it was this time. She estimates no more than 30 feet overhead, and she couldn't move. As Pamela says, it gave off an energy. I was tingling all over. The tingling kind of made me feel funny. I was nervous about it. I was kind of stuck there. I just couldn't move. It kind of made me uneasy. It was too close. It was going down my driveway. I was glad when it took off down over the hill. So she ran inside and told her husband, who asked her why had she not told him. And she explained that she couldn't. She wanted to, but she couldn't move. It was at that point that her son came running into the house. He burst inside and said, "Mom, you won't believe what me and my friend just saw. We saw a flying saucer." And he proceeded to describe exactly what Pamela herself had just seen. So that seems pretty intentional. It was just a few days after this that Pamela and her husband were lying in bed when a small white orb entered through the window and darted around in the bedroom for just a few moments and then zoomed back out the window. Both she and her husband were absolutely awestruck. After this incident, Pamela had a feeling that she was being watched. This kept returning, and for some reason she couldn't explain, she became afraid of looking out the bathroom window. Just a few days after this, she woke up to sense a presence in the bedroom. She felt certain that the Greys were there, or had been there, though she didn't see anything. Things slowed down after that, but in 2019, her son announced that he had seen and actually videotaped a UFO. And in fact, the account was published in the local newspaper. 1 year later, in 2020, Pamela had a dream that a gray ET was looking at her through that same bathroom window that she had been so afraid of looking outside of. So she believes this dream was probably a memory of a true event that had somehow been hidden in her subconscious. But it was a gray, as she says. I guess you'd call it a typical gray, with the big eyes. It was looking back at me. So even as late as 2020, events were still in progress. Once she heard a soft swishing sound over the house and recognized it as the sound the UFOs sometimes make, she still had this sensation of being watched, and she began to wonder if perhaps the ETs had taken her genetics at some point, and that she might have an ET hybrid child or children out there. She's got good reason for thinking this, because as Pamela says, "As I said, I may have children somewhere up there. The other night I had a dream that they came for me again and told me they wanted to show me something. In my dream there were these young adults, part alien looking, part human looking. Their hair was thin and white, almost like an older person's hair. They had some weird looking clothes on, and I said, 'You're mine!' And they all came to me and hugged me. I woke up crying." So this is the kind of detail I've heard from many contactees. and it was absolutely clear to Pamela at this point that the UFOs and ETs were following her family for some reason, and evidence of this came shortly later. In 2020, her son called and said that that night that he had filmed the UFO, something amazing happened, which he at first kept secret, but decided to finally tell her. As Pamela says, that same night he said there were bugs in the bedroom. He said, "You know, they looked like a big praying mantis." He said they just stood there, and when they woke up in the morning, they were gone. He is pretty shook up about it still. So yeah, as you can see, this is something that is ongoing in Pamela's life and her family's life, which is more the rule than the exception with UFO contactees. Again, her story is told in my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness. Again, this case does come from my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness. I somewhat summarized it and shortened it here, so if you want to hear the full story, definitely check out my book. But what an amazing case. She is really an honest and sincere witness. She tried very hard to get all the details correct. She, of course, did review her chapter before it was published in the book and didn't have any corrections, but did have a few additions because, again, events are ongoing. She's a really wonderful person, and I absolutely am honored to share her story with you. So thank you, Pamela. I truly appreciate it. Now let's move to the next case. This one is also very interesting. This I call the Onboard UFO Encounter of Susan. Like many contactees, she prefers to remain anonymous, totally understandable. Her case took place in 1969, one of the major onboard experiences in Adelaide, Australia. But again, certainly not a singular event. She's had many onboard experiences, actually. What I find interesting about her case is that her experiences really show one of the main ET agendas, as we'll see when we get into her case. But she also shows many of these really interesting after effects, including really pronounced psychic abilities. So overall, a truly fascinating and important case. This case comes from Australian researcher Keith Basterfield and involves an anonymous witness with the pseudonym of Susan. She was born in 1959 and she was 8 or 9 years old when she had her first strange experience that she can remember. At the time, she lived with her family near Port Augusta in South Australia. She and her friends were walking outside at night when they noticed a group of 6 unusual-looking lights. They were colored white, red, and green, but they approached and actually hovered over them at low elevation. They became frightened by them and hid in a ditch alongside the road. She's really not sure what happened next, but does have a vague memory of trying to wake up some of her friends who had apparently fallen asleep, while she and others ran across a field, fleeing the scene. It was just 1 or 2 years later, around 1969, 1970, her family had moved to Adelaide, and she recalled lying in bed one evening and had a powerful premonition that they, she's really not sure who, were coming to get her that night. In fact, the feeling became so strong that she convinced her sister to switch beds with her. And sure enough, that night, Susan remembers little beings, and one tall being, entering the room and taking her into another strange room where she underwent some kind of medical examination. This was fully consciously recalled. She also remembered that they took her to another room where they showed her images of something, like a film, she couldn't really remember what, and then conversed with her. She had no other memory of this, other than following this she began having nightmares of that experience, which persisted throughout her entire teenage years. And this is when she also began to experience a wide variety of psychic and poltergeist-like paranormal events. She heard phantom footsteps moving through the house, other strange noises. Sometimes her bike would move by itself. She'd be watching TV, and suddenly she'd get a vision, a premonition of a future event. She sometimes heard calming music coming from no discernible source. So all these things were happening. She grew up, she got married, and sometimes she would have fights with her husband, as happens. And when she got really angry, she picked up a glass of water, it would shatter. A few times knives came out of the drawer and pointed at her husband. She heard strange tapping noises on the ceiling. So did he. One evening, her husband saw her sleeping and she was levitated, floating above her bed. This also occurred at work, weird events. Chairs would move by themselves, phantom footsteps, even occasional apparitions. One time an unseen entity pulled at Susan's hair. Like many contactees, she does have an eidetic memory. She says she sleeps only 2 or 3 hours per night. Years passed, practically a decade, when finally Susan contacted the UFO Research of South Australia. This is a UFO research organization, and she was put in touch with Keith Basterfield, UFO researcher, and she elected to undergo hypnotic regression to recall what might have happened to her as a child. She was taken back to that event at age 10 or 11 when she saw ETs coming into the bedroom. She lay down in her sister's bed, and this is when she started to feel a strange sensation of warmth and expansion, as she put it, and she heard an unusual ringing sound. And she immediately saw small beings and one tall one enter the room. She said the small beings were about 4 feet tall, with large bald heads, large dark eyes, a small nose, a slit for a mouth, bony looking cheeks, so your typical grays. She saw that they did have webbing between their fingers. All of them were wearing flesh-colored one-piece outfits. She didn't see the tall being as clearly, but she could see it was very tall, 7 feet tall, and had a normal-looking nose, and was wearing the same type of suit, but it had what looked like a cape and a hood over its head. So they walked right up to Susan's bed, where her sister was sleeping, because they had switched beds, and they appeared to be momentarily confused that she was not there, but quickly went to the other bed and found her. The tall one began to speak to her telepathically, saying not to be afraid and to go with them. They levitated her from her bed into a standing position. One of the beings handed her a ball of light. So she held that. They surrounded her, and the entire group moved together through the wall and into the yard. And suddenly Susan found herself moving up into the air on, quote, invisible steps towards this bright glowing object. Soon she was surrounded by this bright light coming from this object and found herself with the beings in a strange room. They took this small ball of light from her hands. She was placed on a chair of some kind, which quickly reclined into a horizontal table, and then the tall entity proceeded to conduct some kind of medical gynecological exam. She had the sense that the tall being was concerned about something with her health, perhaps. More tall beings appeared. They made a larger table rise up, and they put her on that. She briefly passed out. When she woke up, she felt somewhat unwell. The small beings helped her to sit up. They gave her a warm, purple-colored drink to consume. She was then bathed in a green light, and the small beings pulled her from the table and had her walk around, which was difficult because her legs felt a little bit numb. But after her legs returned to normal, she was taken over to a pile of cushions on the floor where she sat down. Some of the little grays sat next to her, and it was at this point that she started to see moving images, like a film, appear on the wall in front of her. And this showed a planet floating in space. It zoomed forward and she saw a close-up of trees and a park area, and there were more of the tall beings there. And suddenly, there was a major disaster going on, perhaps an earthquake, she thinks. She saw that many of these beings were dying, and the survivors were being lifted up into a craft. The tall being said that he and the others were survivors of this disaster. He told her that at one point they used to live on Earth. He said that they were interdimensional in nature. They told her that she had to return because she had important work to do on Earth. So they stood her up, handed her this ball of light again, and Susan found herself floating out of the craft down to her home through the wall and back into the bedroom. So this is what she recalled under hypnosis, and she recalled a few other incidents as well. She remembered being taken from a beach at age 12. At age 16, she recalled being taken to what appeared to her to be another planet. At age 19, she was taken again. She doesn't describe these incidents in any real detail, other than to say that they involved physical gynecological examinations and, on at least one occasion, intimate relations with one of the tall ETs. One of these intimate meetings occurred in 1979, and afterwards she believed she became pregnant. She was showing signs of food cravings, enlarged abdomen and breasts, cessation of her cycle. But then she had what she believes to be a spontaneous miscarriage. And the same thing happened again in 1986. After another intimate session with a tall ET, she became pregnant. This puzzled her because she knew she had not had sex with anybody, not on Earth. She began having nightmares of having an ET baby. She became quite ill during this pregnancy and went to the doctor, who did confirm she was pregnant. But at this point, he did not detect any movement in the fetus and became concerned that perhaps it had died in utero. And very shortly later, she experienced a second spontaneous miscarriage. So she had all this stuff going on, and one time she went to the dentist. She got x-rays, and the dentist told her that these x-rays showed two unusual objects in her upper gums. And they asked her if she had had previous dental work, which Susan denied. Years later, she had more dental x-rays which also showed these objects. These x-rays were obtained by researcher Keith Basterfield, and he could see these artificial-looking foreign bodies in her mouth himself. As he said that they were straight metal pieces that appeared to be situated in her upper gums just below her nose. So Keith wrote about this case, and he leaves his interpretation open as to how to explain these events. But again, a very interesting case. There you go. Thanks to Keith Basterfield for bringing that case to the public attention. Really interesting regarding the implants. This is something I think probably most contactees have. I don't think that there's anything nefarious personally to implants. My research has shown actually that they're pretty much health related. But a really fascinating case because it does show the ET's interest in human reproduction. So that makes this case, I think, significant. It's a pattern that has been fairly well established. And remember, these cases are coming from all over the world, from people who don't know each other, and yet are showing amazing similarities. This is corroboration, I think. How can these people all be telling the same story and not know each other unless this is all true? And I think it is, because there are so many cases like these. Again, it's just not one or two people telling these stories. It's a lot of them. And almost all contactees do have corroborating witnesses to some extent. So that alone, I think, is a very important fact that we really need to consider when we try to explain these cases. It's not just one person saying this. So let's move to the next case. This one's also pretty darn interesting. It's not as lengthy as some of the other cases, but it's super fascinating. It's got some really interesting details to it. I call this one the Onboard UFO Encounter of Roberla T. Her case was thoroughly investigated. It occurred on June 23rd, 1973 in Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix has quite a lot of activity. Arizona is one of the leading producers of UFO reports in the United States. But again, UFO encounters occur everywhere. In this case, she did use hypnosis to recover the on-board segment, but absolutely does recall seeing humanoids and having missing time. So it's not like this is being made up out of whole cloth. She does remember quite a bit of her encounter. And some really interesting ones, some unique details in this one. This case comes from researchers Lester Seward and Lex Mebane. The witness is Roberla T., again of Phoenix. And on June 23, 1973, that evening, she stepped out onto her patio, and this is when she noticed a star-like object descending from the sky, eventually hovering at a spot just above the trees beyond her patio. And she could now see that it was a large, solid, illuminated, roundish object, and it was close enough that she could hear a humming noise coming from it. She stood there watching it when a squarish opening appeared. She described it as, quote, like garage doors opening. She could now see a light streaming out from the interior of this opening, and this is when suddenly a human-like figure approached the opening from one side, proceeded to cross to the other side, then bent down to, quote, do something. This surprised her enough that she exclaimed out loud, and apparently this being heard her, because he abruptly leaned out of the opening and stared directly at her. He was only visible from the knees up, but she could see that he was wearing a skin-tight suit of some kind. He dropped his head slightly, and as he looked at her, she could see that he was tall, with a large head. It looked to her like, quote, he was messing around with some instruments. Suddenly she heard another humming noise, and looking off to her left, she saw a second smaller object approaching. It moved off behind a post and disappeared, and immediately looking back to the first object with the humanoid in it, she saw that it too had vanished. At this point, still on her porch, she unaccountably fell asleep, and upon awakening was puzzled to find that she was in a different position. So thinking about this, years later she decided to contact a UFO group called the Ground Saucer Watch, and after speaking with investigators, decided to undergo hypnotic regression. And under hypnosis, she relived this sighting, and then instead of this object disappearing, she saw that the figure she had seen in the doorway of the craft was now standing directly before her on the patio. This being told her not to be afraid, and she suddenly found herself floating upwards. Looking to her side, she saw a dog also floating in the air, and suddenly she found herself inside this dark enclosed room. She had some trouble seeing at this point, but she did feel as though an instrument of some kind was being placed on her head. This made her somewhat uncomfortable and aggravated, as she put it. She did sense the presence of two figures around her, but could not clearly see them. She did have the impression that they were talking to each other in a language she could not understand. And the next thing she knew, she was back on the patio of her home, and it was 4 or 5 hours later. So certainly an interesting, although brief, onboard experience. And in an apparently unrelated case, 10 months earlier, also in Phoenix, a young witness reported seeing a silver-white disc, 45 feet wide, 35 feet tall, sitting on the ground not far from his home. Standing next to the craft was a, quote, very tall, lean male. And as the witness says, he appeared to be 7 feet tall, wearing a silver-gray military-type uniform. He said, "Return to your home. Do not come back until morning." He communicated with his mind. He was firm in his request and compelling, but did not present himself as threatening. I returned to my home. I could hear sirens coming to the location where the saucer and the man stood. 2 to 3 hours later, the police did come to our door and asked my mother to keep all of us indoors that night. So another really interesting humanoid case in Phoenix. Apparently not related, but who knows? It was just 10 months earlier. How about that? Interesting that she saw a dog floating in the air. I did a whole episode on dogs that have been taken on board UFOs. She didn't see the dog on board, but I wonder about it. Her memory of the actual onboard segment is somewhat shady. She doesn't really remember all of it, So it's very possible that there's more to it than she consciously recalls. But another example of someone who's been taken on board these craft. So many of them. And here's another one. This one was published in various newspapers, but hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention. I call this one the Onboard UFO Encounter of Francesco Ojeda. So this one is super interesting because this appears to be a sort of opportunistic event. And by that I mean it doesn't appear that the ETs were specifically seeking out this boy. He kind of just walked up to a landed craft in the forest, and this resulted in an onboard encounter, or so it would appear. This one occurred on March 3rd, 1976 in Fortaleza. This is in Ceará, Brazil, and it's a pretty amazing case with some fairly significant physiological effects. This case was first published in the Brazilian newspaper La Nación and later in an article by Gray Barker in the June 1977 issue of the Saga UFO Report, and was later widely published in several UFO publications. It's sparse on details, but apparently on March 3rd, 1976, 12-year-old Francesco Ojeda disappeared. He was last seen leaving his school in Fortaleza. When he didn't return home that evening, his frantic parents organized a search, and this search continued the day after and the next day, with no trace of Francesco being found. Finally, after 2 days, his parents, guided by Francesco's dog, found him in the forest about 1 mile from his house. He was crying, he was disoriented, he was wandering aimlessly, he was unable to see, and his skin was red as though from a bad sunburn. So they rushed him home, and he had an amazing story to tell. Around 4 p.m., 12-year-old Francesco left his school for the day and was walking through the woods to his home in Fortaleza, Brazil. This was a trip he had taken many times before, of course, but coming to a clearing in the woods, he was amazed to see a shiny, metallic, disc-shaped object resting upon a kind of metal platform. He said a door was open to the craft. He estimated that it was about 40 feet in diameter. But most amazing, standing next to it were 2 humanoids, under 5 feet tall, wearing shiny suits. Francesco had the impression that they were making some kind of repairs to the craft. Now, seeing the boy, the beings were apparently startled, as they immediately leapt into the craft through the open door. The door promptly closed. A device located on top of the craft started to rotate. It then flashed an intense beam of light onto Francesco, blinding him, causing him to fall to the ground semi-conscious, he said. And the next thing he knew, he was waking up inside the craft. He had some trouble remaining fully awake, but he does recall that the beings removed his clothes, placed him on a table. He said a very bright amber light shone down on him, and they began to communicate telepathically, as he says, in my head, and they began to assure him that they intended him no harm. They then told him, quote, "We are coming in great numbers to visit your planet." The next thing he knew, he was back in the forest. His skin was sunburned. He was unable to see. Thankfully, by morning, his sight had returned. But per the La Nación newspaper, it turned out residents of the nearby villages were very concerned, as over the last few nights, an unidentified flying object had been seen by many of them crossing the skies and sending down brilliant beams of light. Pretty darn interesting, and as often happens when people are taken on board, they are physically examined. According to Thomas Bullard, who did the first statistical study of onboard UFO cases, that is the one event most people report. And in fact, I would say the vast majority of people who are taken on board are physically examined. And for that reason, we can conclude that this is one of the reasons people are taken on board. And I've come to learn that a lot of the times this is really all about healing. As you may know, I wrote a book about healing cases, the healing power of UFOs, outlining some 300 cases. It's practically double that now. I keep uncovering new cases. But I say this because I think really, honestly, this is why people are being physically examined. It amounts to a checkup. So now I want to move to the next case. This one, to me, is one of the most interesting in this compilation. This one I call the Onboard UFO Encounter of Dr. Simon Taylor and Reza X. This is a multiple witness onboard UFO case. Both of these men remember their experience fully consciously. Both report the same details. But boy, this one is really unusual. There are some elements to this one that I haven't heard before, at least not in quite this way. But again, there are other things that sound absolutely sort of run-of-the-mill, because an onboard experience does follow a fairly set sequence of events. And we see that here. This one occurred on September 16, 1976 in the Elburz Mountains of Iran. To me, that makes this case super interesting because we rarely get information about UFO activity in Iran. Certainly we've heard sightings there, but reports of onboard encounters there are exceedingly rare. But as it turns out, this one occurred at a very interesting time, bringing quite a bit of confirmation to this event. I think you'll find it an amazing case. This very unusual case comes from UK researchers Peter Huff and Moishe Kallman. It was the mid-1970s when the main witness, Dr. Simon Taylor, was working as an English language instructor in the Imperial Iranian Air Force in Tehran. He comes from England, but was working there, and having some free time, on September 16, 1976, he set off with his Iranian friend Reza to the village of Ahar, located in the Elburz Mountains, also known as the Alborz Mountains. So they parked their car in this little village and set off on a hike up the mountainside, finally stopping for the night in one of the many climbers' cabins that are located all along the mountainside. These cabins are free for anyone to use, and sometime in the middle of the night, Simon woke up to an unbearable heat and a seeming lack of oxygen in the room. His friend Reza was already up, choking and checking to see if the paraffin lamp, which was lit in the center of the room, might be responsible for this lack of oxygen. But within moments, they heard strange crackling sounds outside, followed by a, quote, series of heavy pounding thumps. These were beating on the cabin walls. This was so loud it terrified them both. They immediately ran outside, still dressed only in their long johns and t-shirts, and were immediately confronted by a shocking sight. There were 3 strange-looking figures dressed all in black, with their nose and mouth covered, and each was holding a flashlight-like instrument. And as Simon says, the only feature I can remember is their eyes, slightly mongoloid, similar to the Turco men in northeast Iran, but these eyes were much bigger and more lustrous. It was as though the upper part of their face was all eyes. So their eyes is what really impressed him. He said they were kind of bulging a little bit. And he wondered momentarily if they were Iranian secret police, but immediately discarded this thought, not only because of their unusual appearance, but the beings began to speak to both of them telepathically, saying, "Do not be afraid. Pack your things and follow us." And as Simon says, not one word was orally spoken the entire time we were with them. It was as if their words were transferred into my mind, and I heard myself answer just as one can hear one's own thoughts. So Simon and Reza, to their own surprise, dutifully obeyed and followed these men out of the cabin, down the path for a few hundred feet, when suddenly they were no longer on the path, but inside a strange room. And I'll just let Simon describe what happens. As he says, "Under our feet lay a thick Persian carpet. It was as beautiful as any scene hanging in a bazaar. The whole place was bathed in the softest of lights. We were in the middle of what seemed to be an oval-shaped room, and were invited to sit cross-legged on the floor. A screen took up the whole of one long wall. I call it that, yet I felt as if we could have fallen through. We could see the distant lights of the city. The room began to shake and shudder, and we were told not to be afraid, although this time I did feel nervous. The lights of Tehran began to recede and then swung back into view directly beneath us. The room was swaying like a cable car on its way up a mountain. There was a tremendous pressure in my ears, and I must have looked alarmed because one of the men tried to reassure me. So the men could hardly believe what this window or screen in front of them showed. The craft apparently was taking them on a visit to numerous places all over planet Earth. As Simon says, "I cannot remember all the places we visited, but I distinctly remember fantastic aerial panoramas of London, New York, Paris, and my hometown city of Birmingham. We saw deserts and frozen wastes of ice and snow, seas, more water than I have ever seen in my life. The pictures were crystal clear and 3-dimensional. When we flew near some sheep on an Albanian hillside, they were so close I felt I could reach out and touch them." So during this trip around the world, these humanoids spoke to them telepathically, providing a running commentary about the people in each area, their habits and beliefs. Not once did anyone or anything, any animal outside the craft, react to the presence of the craft. At one point the beings did say that they live on Earth, and added, "We are not as you see us." Suddenly, with no warning, The trip came to an abrupt end. The humanoids told them to exit the craft. Again, obeying the humanoids without question, they stepped outside the room and found themselves suddenly on the pathway. Looking around them in astonishment, they saw that the sun was now high in the sky, and they were only a couple of 100 yards from where they had parked the car the day before. They were miles from where they had been taken. It was now hours later, 2 p.m., so they were missing about 5 or 6 hours of time. Both men were disoriented in a daze. They drove off in silence, weirdly not talking about what had just happened. They drove for about an hour, pulled off at a roadside food stand, and this seemed to, quote, break the spell, as Simon put it, and they both immediately began talking in a rush about what had happened to them. They considered all different theories, everything from a hallucination brought on by fumes from the lamp, food poisoning, a psychotic break, but the fact that they both experienced the same thing seemed to negate all these theories. They drove back to Tehran. Both became violently ill. Simon had crushing migraine headaches, overwhelming fatigue, and later developed an aversion to bright lights, loud noises. He became somewhat depressed. Both men felt emotionally shattered. Simon began having many dreams about this encounter. Reza, his friend, made Simon promise not to talk about it, and soon Reza refused to even discuss the experience, and ultimately this ended their friendship. Now, interestingly, 2 days after returning to Tehran, numerous people all over the city started reporting UFOs. Hundreds of people were seeing UFOs. In fact, one event became world famous when the Iranian Air Force scrambled 2 F-4 Phantom jets to chase an object. This was captured on radar. This object was showed to be the size of a Boeing 707. They actually tried to shoot at this craft, but it disabled the weapons control panel and all communication instruments. So many people viewed this. And there were other reports of visitations as well. For example, according to the Tehran Iran Journal, on September 18, 1976, only 1 day after Simon's and Reza's encounter, a gentleman by the name of Ahmad Bani Ahmad, age 56, and his wife were visiting Lake Tabriz in Iran when they had a remarkable encounter. As Ahmad told reporters, "My attention was caught by a glittering body that landed about 100 yards from my car. My wife and I were terrified. The round object was about 4 or 5 meters across, and there was a small window in the side. 2 beings, similar in shape to Egyptian mummies, stepped out." So Ahmad says that he was actually taken inside the craft and that he believed these figures were, quote, beings from another planet, but he was very reluctant to report it because he thought he would be disbelieved and ridiculed. So there's no other information on this particular case. But after the wave of sightings hit the next day, he decided to go public and share his experience. But back to Dr. Simon Taylor and Reza. Simon says he was never able to fully understand his encounter, but he later shared it with an expert in Iranian theology who told him that his encounter could likely be explained as the trickster spirits known in their culture as jinns. So this theory resonated with Simon, but he wondered about it because, as he says, the entities, whatever their true identity, were real. Of this I have no doubt. They could touch and be touched, see and be seen, speak and be spoken to. We were not dreaming. Simon, like many contactees, would later have quite a few psychic experiences, including a bizarre phone call from an unknown person saying, "Reza has joined Reza." Remember, Reza is his friend, and shortly later he learned that his friend Reza had actually passed away. So that was unusual. He also continually had the feeling that these beings were still with him, watching him. And as he says, "I know they are there, on what I call the tip of my memory. They move around ghost-like at the back of my mind. I know they are there, but not what they are." So interesting. And the witnesses themselves are struggling to interpret this experience, raising all kinds of theories. I think this shows the sincerity of the witness. They're not immediately jumping to, this is UFOs and extraterrestrials. They're really trying to figure it out. I think one of the most puzzling aspects of that particular encounter is the fact that when they went on board, there was a Persian carpet on the floor. Now, this may sound unusual, but I have to tell you, I've investigated other cases with similar details. This is how advanced the ETs are. They can create an environment that will make the witness feel perhaps a little bit more comfortable and simulate an environment that they're familiar with. So this is, I think, probably what's going on here. I can't say for sure. This isn't my experience. So I absolutely have to respect each witness's interpretation of what happened to them, because after all, it is their experience. I personally think it probably was extraterrestrial, given that there was so much UFO activity going on at the same time that these two men had their apparent onboard UFO encounter. All right, let's move to the last and final case of this compilation, which is also super interesting and just a little bit different. I like to present these cases with unique details because I think they answer some of the questions and provide additional information as to what's going on here. So I call this one the Onboard UFO Encounter of Tatiana Mykolaievna. May have butchered her name there a little bit, but I did my best. At any rate, this case took place on September 13, 1989 in the Protvino area of Russia. This is a super interesting case, fully consciously remembered, and also pretty benevolent, although the witness did experience some fear. It's a really amazing case because, like many people, she was essentially given a ride on board this craft. I'm not sure why the ETs are doing this other than to just announce their presence and get people used to the idea that we are not alone in this universe. You can make up your own minds about it, but man, this is an interesting case. This case comes from researcher Vladimir Azaza of the UFO Lab Russia UFO Group and was published in the publication Moskovskaya Pravda. It was around 9 p.m. on September 13, 1989, as the witness, Tatiana Mykolaievna, she's a 40-year-old married mother of 2 children. She was walking near her home located in Protvino. This is not far from Moscow, Russia. She had just gone shopping, was carrying her groceries. Suddenly 2 6-foot-tall women came out from behind a group of nearby boulders and walked right up to her. She was immediately concerned because there was a strange sluggishness, kind of lethargy that came over her, which made it very difficult for her to move, while at the same time she was also frightened by these beings' very unusual appearance. They had light blonde hair, grayish-greenish skin, and wore small silver caps with what looked like 2 antenna-like protrusions on top, and were wearing tight-fitting silver suits. They spoke to her audibly, in perfect Russian, but with a strange squeaky voice, and they invited her to go with them. Now, despite her fear, Tatiana found herself following these 2 strangers along the road for about 300 feet to where there was an electrical transformer station. Sitting on the corner, right there, was a small disc-shaped object, about 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall. A door opened on the side, and 2 women led Tatiana inside. The interior of the craft was completely metallic, except for one large transparent window. She saw what looked like an instrument panel lining the circumference of the room. There were 3 armchairs. In one of them, a man sat with his back to Tatiana. She could see that he had wide shoulders and strong arms, but during the entire encounter, he never moved or turned around. One of the figures who had invited Tatiana on board said, quote, "Fly with us." Tatiana declined politely, explaining that she had many chores to do, including teaching her son his school lessons and preparing dinner. And this is when one of the women told her, "Well, if you hurry, the flight will be over in a short time. Do you agree?" So this time Tatiana gave her consent. Still holding her grocery bag, she decided to offer some of the bread she had just purchased to these beings. And they told her that they do not, quote, "eat your bread," and then offered her a piece of their own bread. One of the ladies reached out and handed a small piece of this bread to Tatiana, and without thinking about it, she immediately took the bread and put it in her mouth and ate it. She said it tasted to her kind of like wheat or rye bread, but was much sweeter. Tatiana then sat down in one of the armchairs, and immediately this craft took off, silently. A light on the ceiling of the room began to revolve rapidly, and looking out this window, Tatiana could now see the rooftops of the city as they flew over this area. She said the flight was very smooth, very calm, and after about 10 minutes of this, Tatiana asked if they could return her back home. One of the ET women asked her, "Where do you live?" Tatiana replied, "In one of the prefabricated buildings in the outskirts of Protvino." They asked her, "On what floor?" She replied, "The 14th floor." At this point, they offered to drop her off on her balcony. Tatiana considered this, but thinking of her husband and children and that they might be frightened by this, she declined this offer and asked them to drop her off in a parking lot near her home, which they did. The ETs said goodbye and told her that they would contact her again someday. Tatiana was not happy to hear this. This encounter, although benevolent, was quite frightening to her. She quickly left without saying goodbye. Researchers did later learn that another resident of Protvino saw a disc-shaped craft lifting up off the ground around the same time as Tatiana's experience. How cool is that? They actually offered to drop her off on her balcony. Me personally, I probably would have said yes in hopes that my family would see it, but I can understand why she declined and asked them to drop her off in a place where her family wouldn't see all this. She was thinking of her family. That's, I think, totally understandable. And I understand that this was frightening for her, even though I think you can agree the ETs were absolutely benevolent. There was no sign of them wanting to hurt people in any of these cases, I don't think. Again, I'm just reporting the facts. It's up to each of us to make up our own minds about it. I do try to present cases that I think are valid and have information that can help us understand what's going on here. I also find it very interesting that in pretty much the vast majority of cases, the ETs are saying the same things. Do not be afraid. Have no fear. No harm will come to you. You're fine. Relax. Calm down. So I think this is significant, and I think these cases are really important. I think all UFO cases are important and interesting, but these onboard cases, they have so much more information than almost all the other cases. That alone makes them worthy of study and interest, I think. And I hope that one day this does go mainstream. It's true, our congressional officials and governments are admitting to the validity of this subject, talking about UFO sightings, even crash retrievals and bodies being held in hangars or what have you. But they're not really talking about the fact that people are having direct contact. And I think that glaring absence is absolutely telling and shows that this cover-up is still fully in place. This is one of the reasons I really like talking about cases of direct contact, humanoids, and onboard experiences, because people deserve to know the truth. And this is the biggest part of the UFO phenomena. Like I said, it's the cutting edge. So yeah, that's why I think these cases are important. So that's it for today. Hope you found this episode interesting, perhaps learned something. It's clear to me this is really going on. There are far too many cases to explain away, as our governments would like to say, as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, or mental illness. No way does that account for the implants and the physiological effects and the multiple witness cases and the landing traces and the fact that some of these objects are being caught on radar and photographed and so forth. So yeah, clearly something is going on here. Any logical person can see that. So thank you again. I truly appreciate it, you guys. It's because of you I'm doing this research. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. It's up to you. And most of all, keep having fun. I will see you next time. Bye for now.